I'm going to give a talk about form following failure, and I'm going to explain how architectural or engineering or urban design form has often followed a failure rather than a logical pattern. Next, please. Architects grow up with a lot of slogans being thrown at them. And in the 19th century, there was a famous little dictum called form follows function. And there were various architects in America, particularly in Chicago, like Louis Sullivan, who believed that architectural form should express functions. He didn't always follow it in his buildings, mind you, but he believed that forms should emerge from the function rather than just be a stylistic thing. Well, people have challenged that since. A man called Robert Venturi uh, challenged it very strongly and said form actually doesn't follow function, it follows culture. And then cynics have said form follows form. You just get one form and other architects follow it, or engineers follow previous forms. And then some even suggested it's the other way around. The function is squeezed into the form. The function is followed, the form's decided, and you push the function into it. Anyone teaching in the School of Architecture will know that students often design a shape and try and cram some school or some church or some supermarket into that shape, which doesn't easily lend itself. So different plays with words, function and form. But I came to the conclusion that many forms have followed failure, and that the architectural design of streets, of buildings, of bridges, of all manner of structures doesn't necessarily emerge from a logical problem analysis. It grows out of a colossal failure, and somebody's had to work out what went wrong and how to rectify it. Next, please. So how has architecture and urban form derived from past failures, such as fire and structural failure, including bombing perhaps, including in our present time, COVID? What has been the effect of these kind of hazards or these events on our environment, on our built environment? Next, please. A good example of this happened in Britain in 1666, when we had a great fire of London. The fire raged and it destroyed the central part of the city of London, including a cathedral and numerous churches. And it was very well documented by Samuel Pepys, who wrote a diary about it. And we know more or less what happened and how long the fire lasted, and what happened to the people after it. Next, please. All manner of interesting things happened. For example, people came here to Oxford, which is 60 miles away from Oxford, from London, and they were allowed to work in Oxford. They gave work permits so they could get their own disaster relief by being allowed to work in this place, and some refugees came here. After the fire went out, there was a colossal utopian desire to rebuild London looking better, and it took 4 days for the King's Surveyor, Christopher Wren, who designed St. Paul's Cathedral, to come up with the first design. He didn't mess about in those days. They didn't establish a planning commission. It was 4 days later he proposed a radical new kind of form to London based on the Royal Exchange and a newly built cathedral, straightening out all the uneven roads, wide roads, partly because of the fire risk, but partly because he wanted to look more like Paris. That was rejected by the mercantile forces in London, who wanted it exactly the way it was before. It brings out an important principle. After a disaster, you've got two forces at work: those who want to reform and change everything and build a better world, and those who want to re-establish the status quo, the reformist movement and the conservative movement. Next, please. Well, out of it came a Building Act, which we still have in London, the London Building Acts of 1666, and they said no more wooden building in London. Buildings to have party walls going right up through the roof, so that in the top attic, which used to be open, now has a wall going through it right up to stop fire spread horizontally. and brick was to be required to be used in buildings. And they appointed building surveyors, and London has different building controls than any other town in Britain. And it goes back to 1666. And what's more, we haven't had a severe fire since, apart from when the Luftwaffe tried to bomb London during the Second World War. Next, please. They stipulated the heights of buildings, they stipulated road widths, and those road widths were to enable people to escape. And they stipulated the thickness of walls at different levels of the house. And this was a logical process, and this changed the pattern of building. London looked different in the reconstruction. Next, please. And the style changed from half-timbered buildings to load-bearing buildings, a bit like in this drawing. Next, please. We got a new cathedral, St. Paul's, built in the Renaissance Baroque style, and on the right, a brick building built with the London Building Acts, a change of material, a change of building form, all growing out of this fire. We're not going to allow a fire like this ever to happen again in London. Next, please. So disaster was a big opportunity. There's a famous saying in China, in Mandarin language, that disaster, the word crisis has two roots. One is dangerous, the other is chance or opportunity. And here's an example of people grasping the opportunity. Well, half grasping the opportunity. We didn't straighten out all the streets. We did, in fact, change a lot of the architecture. So it was partially grabbed, this opportunity. Next, please. Just before I go on to this building, this picture, Lisbon, after the 1759 earthquake, much more radical than London. They built against fire, against tsunami, and against earthquake. New designs for houses. They raised the level of the whole town. They widened the streets, and they put in special ways to fight fires. So Lisbon was the first urban designed city to accommodate earthquake risk from 1759. This house on the screen is by Frank Lloyd Wright. It's often heralded as one of the great masterpieces of 20th century. It's in a place called Bear Run in Pennsylvania, and it was built for a supermarket family called the Kaufman family as their weekend house. They owned this land in a river valley, a spectacular valley, and they wanted the house where you could see a waterfall. Frank Lloyd Wright, a very famous architect at that time, perhaps the most famous in America, he wanted it to sit on top of the waterfall so you could have an even better view of it where you couldn't actually see it from the house, but he thought it would be exciting to perch it above the waterfall. Well, everybody objected. The water authority said this must not be built like this because there's a flood risk in the river valley, and it's very dangerous. Other people didn't like these cantilevers, and so there were endless complaints. To which Wright replied, "Don't you realize I'm a famous architect? So stop talking and just let me get on with it," which he did, and his client let him have it. Next, please. Well, it was severely damaged in floods 3 times. It's been rebuilt 3 times over. And unfortunately, Edgar Kaufman Jr. observed one of those floods and documented what happened. The whole house being affected as the water cascaded through it. But they had the money to rebuild it. But it's an example of a form being actually pulverized by the hazard and the ignoring of the risks. It wouldn't have been such a spectacular house if it had been built further away from the flood risk. There's no doubt about that. But this was an example of highly irresponsible architecture. I used to talk about wonders of architecture in lectures. Then I started talking about prudent floodplain management. Next, please. While I was in Finland a couple of years ago, we came across this little town which had been destroyed in fires, and they rebuilt the whole town twice, and they rebuilt it with much wider streets so people could escape, and you could get fire primitive fire engines in to deal with it, and they also changed many of the materials from wooden buildings in consequence. Next, please. And they tried to widen the streets again to make it safer so that people could escape, because many had died in the very narrow alleyways. Next, please. And here's an example of in Davos in Switzerland. There's this church, and the eastern end of the church faces up the mountain, and it's designed like the prow of a ship. And it's designed because this church had been destroyed in an avalanche. So the architects, when they rebuilt the church in about 1700, they decided to have a pointed end to the church facing up the mountain, so that if there was a future avalanche, the church would stand some chance of being protected. And I don't think it's ever been subjected to the test. I don't think there's ever been an avalanche. I tried to find that out and nobody knew, but the church is still standing. And it's an example of a very different shape of church, and perhaps quite unique. Maybe there's no other church anywhere that looks like this one, but it was rebuilt. The form followed the failure. That's what happened. Next, please. So in this short talk, I just want to remember some examples of forms following failure. And I just would invite anyone watching this presentation to think about your own location and think, has our own town, has our own architecture, has our own administration changed because of adaptation to some hazard? In 1970, there was a terrific cyclone in Bangladesh. It killed about 242,000 people. And it resulted in a great deal of heart searching as to how to avoid such a thing ever happening again. And out of it, the Red Crescent, an NGO working with the Bangladesh government, devised a system called cyclone shelters. And in all the vulnerable coastal areas, which are the areas most prone to the cyclone, where you've got surge water coming in, they built these buildings, often round shaped, to stand up better to wind forces, where people could go once there'd been a warning issued, and they would sit it out and come back and find their house had gone. And as a result of that, cyclone shelters were built right down the whole Indian coastline and right down the Bangladeshi coastline. And they've saved tens of thousands of lives. You require, though, a good warning system to go with it, like advance information, a cyclone is coming. And you require many other things. You require someone to come along and say, well, look after your houses while you're out. It's like vigilantes coming to protect the house. And you maybe require people to look after your animals. So the form was cyclone shelters. The event was a cyclone. And then in the South Asian tsunami of 2004, there hadn't been a proper tsunami warning system in operation in the southern Indian Ocean. And that was devised. And that is now in operation. It's very unlikely that that would have happened without there being the tsunami. But the tsunami was the trigger, and out of it came a warning satellite system using buoys in the ocean. They've had their own problems because those buoys they put in the sea, which transmit signals from the seabed to satellites for the warning system of tsunami waves and an earthquake action on the ground, those buoys have attracted fish. And fishermen have come around to try and get those fish, and they've seen the batteries on these buoys and they've stolen them. So there've been all sorts of problems there. But the warning system is in place, and that warning system is working. And that is, and in fact, the warning systems has been one of the great ways that disaster risk has been managed against flooding, against tsunami, against cyclones in the last 20 years. The Pakistan earthquake of 2006 resulted in something quite remarkable. 600,000 houses built by the government housing authority using an owner-builder approach. They weren't given houses built by contractors. They built their own houses. They were taught how to do it by the army of all people. And I was really impressed with this project. So I'm going to talk in a later talk about some of the people who I've greatly admired. And the Maggie Stevenson, who advised on this project, is one of those heroes, or heroine in her case. But this was where the first time, I think, a new approach to reconstruction took place, training people in how to build safely on a huge scale following an earthquake. That was a real eye-opener to me to see that project. And a few years later, when I was in Haiti after the earthquake of 2010, there was a major change in policy. This wasn't something you could see, but instead of giving goods to people after disasters, which might have been building materials or tools or blankets or whatever, food, they started to say to people, what are your needs? We're not going to send in a team to tell you what your needs are. We want to know what your needs are. And they gave them cash without strings. And previously this had been tried, and the agencies were very wary because they said if people are given cash, they'll buy alcohol or guns. It was found out that they didn't buy alcohol or guns, they acted responsibly. So there has been a great switch in the whole humanitarian movement away from kind giving to cash giving. And the Haiti earthquake heralded a lot of that. And that's been a very positive step forward. It has kept people's dignity and has enabled them to be much more flexible in their giving. It also means that you have to resist huge commercial pressures if you're a government or an NGO. And then I've been speculating here in Oxford, UK, about COVID. And David, you might have thoughts about this from Canada, but I was impressed visiting BC in the early years of this, probably about 2008, when the government of British Columbia were advocating people work from home much more to cut down on traffic congestion. And that's obviously happened in Britain. We've had cleaner air. We've had far fewer respiratory problems because of cleaner air, because of less travel on the roads. People have been working from home and probably will go on working from home, maybe for half the time, those who can. You can't in a factory, of course, but office workers. It's going to throw into question all the office buildings which are in cities, which we might not need. Zoom technology has enabled people to work effectively, maybe not as effectively as in meetings, where you have eye contact and you have observe behavior and you can enjoy being with people. And then there's been improvements in house design and ventilation and personal hygiene, washing our hands more, being much more careful about how we go about our business. So the COVID pandemic, I think, has had big social changes and maybe architectural changes and maybe significant changes. And the problem of the climate change, which we're seeing come to a bit of a climax, is having massive changes in heating systems, in ventilation, in patterns of house building, all sorts of things. So my argument is that forms follow failure. We should accept that that happens, try and find out what those new forms are, and if possible, change them without failure. Why wait for failure to change where we know change is needed? But sometimes failure is the catalyst. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Ian. Ian, thank you very much. That's really fascinating. And it just made me think of how human beings respond to threat and hazard. And it seems to me there are three strategies that dominate. And I'm sure there are exceptions to it, it's not universal, but one strategy is just denial. We'll tend to deny risk. A second strategy is we tend to be reactive and not sort of be proactive about hazards and risk. And a third one is that we tend to respond incrementally in small steps as opposed to taking a large leap. And your talk about form follows failure just made me think about that kind of sequence in terms of how I see it. And so I wonder, number one, do you agree with that, that those are our three dominant strategies, and how form over following failure fits into that?
Yes, I like those three very much. In fact, I could almost add one, which is that a kind of exaggeration. Occasionally, there's been exaggeration of the risk. For example, there was a Tay Bridge disaster in Scotland when a railway fell off a bridge and the bridge collapsed. And it found out that the factor of safety for the bridge was designed for a ridiculously low wind loading. A court of inquiry was set up, and they even got the Astronomer Royal to be part of it, which was a bit strange. He didn't really have much of a qualifications about wind speeds, but they then decided that future wind loading had to be colossally high, which is why the Forth Rail Bridge is so huge and bulky, because they over-designed. And maybe that can happen as well. Now, just going through the different denial, I think that often happens. We've often had a disaster where there's been failure and not much has happened. I think in some of the big cases, there have been courts of inquiry set up, and they've often required new building acts, and that's resulted in a completely changed pattern. So maybe denial is offset when there've been these kind of public demand for some radical change. It might be happening as we talk for structural safety in Miami because a building has collapsed and we're not sure why, and maybe there will be a change in the regulatory environment over that. The other factors I think are very, very appropriate. We don't often know what acceptable risk is, and it's getting the correct level for where buildings should be is very complicated and often results in conflict. I mean, we once visited an area on the River Thames where they were putting in seawalls to protect communities which had been flooded over and over again. And here was a community which was a quite united community, pulling together well and working well. The seawall was going to cut off the view of the sea for many people and provide protection for many others. And the community was then split into two communities, those who wanted the change and those who didn't want it. And that tension continued on. Disaster risk can cause division, I think, socially. It can also put up the cost of some kind of provision to a phenomenal degree. There's lots of questions in Britain now about sea level rise and what it's going to do to some of our motorway systems, because are they high enough to cope with anticipated flood levels? Will they have to raise the whole level up in certain parts of Britain because they miscalculated the possible height of future flood levels? They're much higher than they'd anticipated. So it's endless problems, I think, about it. I just feel that is a bit of the art of the kind of the future, trying to work out what is going to happen. It's not easy. It's not easy to know where hazards are changing, what the future will be. But the principle, I think, is there that we do disasters expose weakness and failure, and from failure we can get new forms. They're not always ideal forms. They might be partial, but they might be refined in the future. A good example of this is happening in Jamaica, where they had building acts in Jamaica, which go back to 1907. But those building acts related to a different kind of architecture than exists in Jamaica now, long before reinforced concrete. And it's only recently that they've revised the building acts. And they've revised them in a very exciting way, whereby they've even got different kind of building acts for people below middle class levels, so that you have different ways of enforcing building standards on poor people, using more like a kind of clinic approach, whereby people get consultations, and people who can't afford the bylaws are now given examples, and they work in a different way for people living in squatter settlements. That's very encouraging, because up to now, governments have been very wary of giving advice to people living illegally in squatter settlements, because it's a form of acceptance. But in Jamaica, this has happened thanks to the Global Facility for Disaster Reduction of the World Bank have been giving help to the Jamaican government, and that's very impressive. So I think forms do follow failure. They don't follow it very well, but we can look to failure as a trigger for improvements. And many of the big improvements that have happened, particularly in warning systems, are as a result of failures. And that's to the good. I just wish it happened more often, and I wish that there'd been more safety brought in. But people don't necessarily protect themselves in a logical way. They protect themselves because they are forced to do so by new laws or by public pressure.
So I think you make a really good point. Sometimes after disasters, events become transformational, as opposed to sort of building back the same way. And not necessarily always in a good way, as you say. Like I'm thinking after New York in 2001, after that attack, when the Twin Towers went down, the United States responded by creating the Department of Homeland Security. And there was a great shift towards, in emergency management in the field, towards security issues. And many scholars have argued that that shift actually made the country more vulnerable to disasters of natural origins, like strong hurricanes and so forth, in the rush to protect themselves against the evil other. And sometimes Hurricane Hazel in Toronto, for example, led to a transformation of how flood risk in Ontario was handled in a very good way. But there are many examples of fires and floods and other situations which haven't led to a change in form.
Yes.
So what do you think? This is a social, these are social political decisions. And I'm wondering what, within what context and what sort of conditions would exist in society that allow for transformational change as compared to a sort of denial and building back the same way?
Well, I think it would require the relevant professions to have sufficient clout or creativity or effort to capitalize on these opportunities that present themselves, to suddenly realize that here is an opportunity for some kind of change, and we can be more creative. And as I've been looking at failures of bridges, for example, it's fascinating to see how that happened. I mean, for example, Robert Stevenson built a remarkable rail bridge across the Menai Straits in Wales, which was a box girder, which spanned a colossal distance, but it had strong wind resistance. And when Brunel, the great Victorian engineer, built the Saltash Bridge in Plymouth, he used wrought iron, a circular form, because of the wind resistance, and he learned from it to do it differently. I think engineers are very remarkable in the way that they can adapt and change, and they know what their colleagues have been doing, and that when a bridge fails, like the famous Wobbly Bridge in Seattle, radical change can happen all over the world very quickly. I've always been impressed in earthquakes, to be in an earthquake situation, and there are engineers there taking photographs of the damage, not because of relief, but they're trying to document what happened to certain building types. And they then document it, and change can happen very, very quickly in building codes in other countries as a result of this kind of community of engineers who share their knowledge across the professional boundaries. I don't think architects are nearly as good at this, but I think that there are changes, and we're watching them at the moment, because buildings are going to have to become much better ventilated, I think, after the pandemic. And we've got to see, maybe that will coincide with electric cars, where there's less pollution in the streets, and so we can breathe the air. But we've created a whole nation of deep buildings. very deep plans, so you don't have much windows around. And they're not going to work well if we want better ventilation, natural ventilation. And so there's going to have to be big changes in architectural form, I think. And whether they'll be backed up by legislation or just in public demand or by media pressure, I don't quite know. I just think that there will be changes, and those changes are probably going to happen very quickly. We're going to see a lot of adaptation of of past buildings to new functions too, because online retailing has taken over from much of the high street, and so we've got redundant shops, and they've got, what are we going to do with them? Are they going to become houses? Well, how do we make those into houses? And what kind of houses will they be, or what kind of apartments, and so on? Big challenges for the profession. You get a kind of different actors, regulatory bodies, government commissions, the architecture profession, the engineering profession, the public health profession, geographers, the academic community, the media. There's different people involved in all these things. And when you get a kind of nexus where these forces are combined, you can get positive action taking place. And that's, I think, what we're looking for, and hope that might happen. I'm a bit optimistic. I think that we do see responsive behavior happening, not always right, but happening, and we need to capitalize on it when it can take place.
So just to finish off, and I thank you again for your time and your wisdom. If you were sitting in my place interviewing the eminent Professor Davis, is there a question you would ask that I have not asked?
Well, I think I'd ask, what do I get most enjoyment from in my work? What do I find most satisfying? What do I gain most from? What is the measure of success in what I've been trying to do all these years? Maybe something on those lines.
And how do you answer that question?
Well, I think a lot of it goes back to education. I'm a bit passionate about education, and I found my own education immensely rewarding because of inspirational teachers at university and when I did my doctorate, and the colleagues I had, and I get great pleasure in seeing how past PhD students are succeeding and teaching me things and challenging me and saying, why did you write that, etc. And I just find the whole process of higher education wonderful, because if you're building a flood wall in 2021, it will have the technology of 2021. It won't have the technology of 2040 or 2050, because we're not there yet. We're always limited by what is around at the present time. All physical provision is limited by present knowledge. But if I educated somebody well in their PhD work or a master's course or undergraduate program or in a summer school, that person might benefit from that experience 30, 40, 50 years into the future. So I'm investing deep into the 21st century through education, and that is what makes it so exciting. I can't think of anything more important than education. I think Mandela was correct. Education is one of the most important things in the world. I think faith is a bit more important, but never mind. But I think education is colossally important, and so I get great pleasure in looking back on that process, my own education, and what I've tried, often with huge mistakes, to do with other people. It's been an exciting adventure, and tragically, David, I don't think it gets the money it deserves. I don't think if governments give it the money it requires. Too many ministers want to cut tape to open projects. They want to see photographs of a new hospital or a new whatever. You don't see them gaining huge kudos from approving a grant for improved educational curriculum or something like that. And that's really what we need. We need a continuous process of a focus on education at every country and at every level.
That made me think of a friend of mine who's a vice president in a IT company, and he was arguing to put a lot of money into training their staff, and somebody was challenging him and saying it was so expensive to do that. And his response was, if you think education is expensive, think about the cost of ignorance.
Wonderful. Yeah, great
So,
reply. Thank you very much.
On that note, I want to thank you again for a most enjoyable and educational talk. We'll talk again soon.
Great pleasure being with you. Thank you.